I stepped into an alien ship once, and what I walked away with was a lesson about Jesus that made my hands tremble and my church-going neighbors frown. I don't expect you to believe every line that follows. I only ask that you listen as if a man in a small town is telling you the strangest thing he has ever seen, because he is. If you want to hear the whole thing, stick around, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the rest of this account. Frank Morrison lived where the road thinned into dust, and the horizon lay wide and soft as a promise. He was 62, his fingers knotted from years of stubborn levers and bolts, his face the map of a life that had weathered marriage, loss, and the slow decay of numberless small satisfactions. He kept an old Chevy in the shed, a stack of oil-stained rags by the workbench, and a habit of making his coffee too strong on mornings that felt like they might go wrong. People in town said he kept to himself. Truth was, he had learned to keep his distance from the kind of conversation that asked for more than he could honestly give. The night the sky folded open over his field began with a storm, the way storms begin in the parts of the world that still remember how to sound like the end of things. Wind pushed at the eaves until the boards complained. Rain broke like strings of glass against the tin roof. Frank woke to a sound he did not have a word for, a low, deliberate pressure that made the windows hum. He dressed, because habit is the first defense against panic, and stepped out where the light from the house pooled like a red memory. In the morning the field had changed. Where the corn stubble should have been, something sat low and smooth and wrong-colored, half buried in wet earth. It caught light like oil on water, a black mirror cupped by the mist. Close up, the surface was not uniform metal, but a lattice of interlocking plates, each seam alive with a blue that seemed to inhale. It made the hair on his forearms lift. Frank did what he had always done. He approached with his hands open and his head full of practical questions. Is it dangerous? Is it salvageable? Does it have anything that looks like a manufacturer's plate? He ran a hand along the hull and felt, under a crust of mud, a warmth that was not heat so much as intention. Something had been active and had stopped for a reason. Neighbors came out with their curiosity tucked under their coats and voices like church bells, murmurs at a distance. He waved them off. He did not need an audience. He needed a plan. He hauled the truck, the winch, the tarps. He cleared brush, measured angles, and judged with a mechanic's exactness the way a thing had been made. The ship hummed in time with his breath. The first thing Frank noticed when he opened a section of the hull, pried a seam where the blue light pooled, was not metal tools or circuitry in a way he understood, but crystals set along the inner ribs like the teeth of a comb. They were not like the quartz he had seen on tourist shelves. These were smoky, reflective, and warm to the touch. Each seemed to hold a small storm inside. They were embedded with filaments that pulsed when his hand came near, and the pulses resolved into a shape in his mind. Not words, not the clumsy syllables of any language he had learned, but images, movement, weather, a voice like the room before a sermon. He should have called someone. He should have waited for authorities, for scientists, for the ritual of confirmation that keeps people sane. He didn't. He carried the smallest of the crystals in his palm and felt like a boy with a secret. The alien did not appear for hours. When it finally moved, it emerged as if it were waking from a machinery dream. It was not monstrous. It was not our caricature of what visitors from other places must be. It was tall and too slender in the joints, its skin the color of oil when a storm hides the horizon. Its eyes were deep and reflective, a glass black that gave back everything you offered with a clarity that was almost rude. There was a precision to the way it put its hands that could manipulate a wristwatch without crushing it. It moved with a mechanic's calm. Frank expected paralysis, panic, the cold pruning blade of fear. Instead, the alien projected, slow at first, and then with a clarity that flattened the world into a single line, a presence that was not sound, but meaning. The word that came to him in that first wash of telepathic contact was simple and absurd. Mechanic. Then images, gears, oil, someone teaching someone else to listen to the rhythm of a problem. The being was a mechanic of machines and perhaps of something else. Communication took the shape of intention. The creature's first accessible sentences were demonstrations, touching a plate and making the pulses run in a language of light. When Frank tried to say hello, the impression the alien returned was a nod and a single concept: repair. Its interest mirrored his own. It needed hands that could turn bolts, and Frank was a man with 50 years of hands. So, unglamorous, practical, and in some strange way honored, they began to work. The repair that followed stretched over 3 days and nights, and belonged to a rhythm Frank knew well: diagnose, isolate, replace, test. He crawled into the belly of the vessel and found components that bent familiar mechanics into uncanny geometry. Crystals served as nodes, not power plants in the way he understood electricity, but as amplifiers of pattern and intention. Wires were replaced by braided filaments that sang when he stroked them. A panel responded not to a screwdriver, but to focus, curling his attention into a specific place and holding it there until the part obeyed. Between tightening a clamp and resetting a filament, the alien fed him images, snatches of landscapes, flashes of people, and then something that made the back of his neck prickle. Faces of a kind he recognized from every painting in the church by the square. A figure with a gaze that was not exactly human, yet undeniably human in the line of the nose and the kindness around the mouth. It was not a voice speaking the name. It was the suggested pattern of a life, of teachings condensed into frequency. The alien did not say Christ in our tongues. It offered an archive of a teacher who organized intention. Not prophecy, the images seemed to say, translation. Frank found that he could understand insofar as he would allow himself to be shaped by the images. The alien's method of teaching resembled a mechanic's apprenticeship: show, repeat, allow the student to do. Each demonstration was followed by a small experiment Frank could run himself. The first experiment was low stakes. Think of a number, make the number your single point of attention, and watch how the world begins to nudge to match the attention. Number, the alien suggested into his head, a projection of pattern. Frank chose 47 without a reason he could give anyone who asked. 47 had been his father's locker number, a coin flipped once in the air that landed tail and left an odd comfort. The alien made no fuss about the symbolism. It presented the number as a handle. On the second morning, after a night of listening to the ship breathe like a sleeping animal, the alien instructed him: focus, feel gratitude as if the number already existed in his life. Hold the feeling for 5 minutes without breaking. Frank, who had spent years in prayer rooms with words that felt like coins clanged on stone, found the practice startlingly simple and alarmingly intimate. It asked for no confession, only attention. He began the experiment in the shed under the hum of the patched hull. He sat on a battered stool, closed his eyes, and thought of 47. He traced its shape in his mind's eye. He imagined it appearing on his watch face, on a calendar, on a stranger's tag. The alien's crystal under the table pulsed when his attention synced, a tiny, steady heartbeat like a second opinion from the world itself. 5 minutes later he opened his eyes, and the blue in the crystal had softened. At first the results were nonsense, coincidences the world offers to anyone paying attention. He saw 47 on a mile marker during his drive back into town, then on a motel receipt, then on a lottery scratcher he'd throw away without looking twice. Frank shrugged and told himself he would not make a religion out of a number. The alien smiled, or at least Frank had the impression of a smile in the shimmer of its eyes, and nudged him to iterate. Stay consistent, amplify gratitude, and add a sensory anchor. The second experiment required the crystals. The alien placed 3 small stones in his palm and taught him a ritual that felt more like a technician's checklist than a liturgy. Center the breath, press the stone between thumb and finger, picture the number, name the feeling aloud, sleep with the stone under the pillow. The creature's projection of a teacher, it called the heart teacher, accompanied the instructions with a slow demonstration of presence, a steadiness like a ship holding position in deep water. If this were a textbook, the alien's impression said in a tone that tasted of oil and rain, it would call them amplifiers. Frank obeyed. He slept with the smallest crystal beneath his pillow and did not expect anything dramatic. What he got was small and accumulative. A dream of walking through a sunlit corridor lined with faces that watched without judgment. A neighbor who mentioned in passing that his lottery ticket had 7 numbers and that the machine spat out 47 today. The barista at the diner giving him a receipt stamped 47. Each instance was thin as silk. Together, they braided into something that felt like response. The alien's teaching, woven into these experiments, pushed farther than mere number tracking. It offered a reframing of a phrase Frank had heard all his life in the church, the kingdom within. The projection, part archive, part simulation, showed a field of light under a human chest, a kind of tuning fork. The teacher figure that accompanied the archive spoke, and Frank experienced the speech as a pressure on his ribs. The kingdom is a frequency, the archive said. Jesus, in that condensed memory, had been someone who taught how to tune. This is where nervousness shows up on people's faces when they hear the story. The conflation of a canonical figure with what an alien mechanic might translate into parametric terms. I will not claim history has been rewritten. The alien's presentation was explicitly an interpretation, a cross-cultural translation. It did not assert that the world's churches had been wrong so much as suggest that rituals and words were one way of encoding functions of attention that are universal. It proposed, in a kind and clinical way, that what Jesus called faith could be read as an expertise in aligning one's inner frequency with desired outcomes, the sort of discipline a mechanic might call calibration. Frank's own inner life resisted. What he had been taught in the pews about grace and surrender did not easily reduce to technique. There was a moral muscle attached to his faith, compassion toward the poor, forgiveness of debt, that the alien's model risked loosening into a self-engineering manual. The creature, by contrast, did not press ideology. It asked for practical tests. That was its language. On the 3rd day, the ship woke. Frank had worked elbow-deep in uncanny machinery until the sun leaned with fatigue, and the ship's hull sighed, as if satisfied or perhaps impatient. The alien moved to a central console that had been inert for 48 hours and, with a gesture, sent a folded projection across the space between them. This was not the patches of image he had seen before, but a downloaded scene that uncoiled in the air like a memory. It was a life. Feed the hungry, walk with those who grieved, speak truth to power. Interlaced with the scene were threads showing small acts of attention. A hand blessing bread while silently insisting on a particular possibility. Someone breathing gratitude until fear softened. A woman holding a child's hand and picturing safety until the child's breathing evened. Frank watched and felt as if someone had untied the knot he carried in his chest. The projection did not diminish acts of mercy. It pointed to the possibility that mercy and mastery of attention could live in the same life. The alien narrated, if one could call those impressions that, by reproducing patterns. How a steady mind organizes circumstance. How emotion amplifies thought into field. How repetition dresses possibility into habit. When the ship finally prepared to leave, the alien did 2 things that changed Frank's life. It gave him 3 crystals, one small enough to fit in a pocket, one to place under a pillow, and one larger that he was told to set upon his workbench. They were warm and heavy with the sense of being tuned. It also presented him with a download, a vision of a leader-teacher standing among the hungry, his hands open, and saying in the tone of the projection, "The kingdom is the practice of presence." The image was not a command to abandon his church or to shun the rituals he'd known. Instead, it made the rituals look like tools that could be used with greater intention. Take what works, the alien's mental tone suggested as it packed the ship for departure, not with arrogance, but with the careful detachment of one who returns tools to their owner. Test. The ship lifted in a way that made the ground seem blessed and absurd at once. It did not blaze like a Hollywood climax. It threaded its way upward, a quiet exhalation. The blue seams pulsed once and then slowed until they were memory. When the neighbor's dog stopped barking and people reassembled in the field to whisker, Frank stood at the edge of the hull with the 3 crystals in his hands and felt oddly exposed, as if his life had been put under a different sky. In the weeks that followed, Frank did the thing the alien suggested with the stubbornness of a man who had been taught to fix what was broken rather than to hope for miracles. He sat for 5 minutes twice a day, sometimes in the shed with the larger crystal humming on the bench, sometimes at the kitchen table while a kettle hissed. He named the number 47, and also other small intentional things. A call from my sister, a steady week of work, a stranger to smile at me first. He kept a notebook, because that is what people with his hands do. Record, measure, repeat. The changes were not cinematic. No overnight fortune bowed the fields. Instead, they were an accumulation of small alignments that, when added, made worry less the default. A job offer came from a man he had fixed a tractor for once and then forgot about. A neighbor paid him with a box of tomatoes and an unexpected check. A woman at the diner remembered his name and asked after his elbow injury. A child who had been afraid of thunder hugged him without prompting. Each was a thin thread, easily snapped, and Frank knew the difference between coincidence and causality, the way a mechanic knows the difference between a loose alternator and a fried starter. He did not claim omnipotence. He claimed practice. News travels in rural places the way sunlight moves across a field, without malice and sometimes faster than you mean it to. The story reached Pastor Williams in his own slow manner. A friend of a friend saw a black craft, heard a rumor of telepathic contact, and a conversation began that grew teeth as it moved. Pastor Williams came by the shop one evening with the kind of worry that is more about care than accusation. He had a face lined by decades of counseling parishioners, and a voice that tried to be both pastor and reasonable man. Frank expected confrontation. He expected the old arguments about the nature of miracles, the danger of dabbling in foreign things, of being seduced into thinking one's will could remake grace. Instead, their conversation was an exchange of 2 men who had chosen different metaphors for the same hunger. Pastor Williams spoke of Scripture, of the need for humility, of how many people are preyed upon by promises of golden fixes. Frank spoke of hands in soil, of the steadiness of practice, of the strange interior calm that had lessened his fear. Neither changed the other's mind, but the meeting mattered because it put his choice into the light of community. Frank was not a private experimenter practicing in isolation. He had to live with the eyes of those who would name him heretic or healer, depending on the day. "You've been to the edge," Pastor Williams said finally, with no triumph in his mouth. "We are called to test everything." "And we are called to act," Frank replied. "We are called to try leavening dough and to feed the hungry. That's what I am doing. I learned a way that helps me tend my heart steady. I didn't get a map to rule the world." Pastor Williams nodded. The tension remained, but so did a thread of mutual human concern. The town would gossip. People would try the strange theory and fail, and some would find solace and call it revelation. Others would denounce it as sorcery. Frank anticipated both outcomes and accepted them with the tired generosity of someone who had spent half a life living with the consequences of things gone wrong. "You've been to the edge," Pastor Williams said finally, with no triumph in his mouth. "We are called to test everything." "And we are called to act," Frank replied. "We are called to try leavening dough and to feed the hungry. That's what I am doing. I learned a way that helps me tend my heart steady. I didn't get a map to rule the world." Pastor Williams nodded. The tension remained, but so did a thread of mutual human concern. The town would gossip. People would try the strange theory and fail, and some would find solace and call it revelation. Others would denounce it as sorcery. Frank anticipated both outcomes and accepted them with the tired generosity of someone who had spent half a life living with the consequences of things gone wrong. I will tell you now, plainly, that this account is not a conversion manual and not a theological manifesto. It is a story about a man who found a practice that made his life a little less brittle. The alien's teachings were offered as translations, mechanic to mechanic, teacher to apprentice, and filtered through Frank's own long history of prayer, losses, and quiet vows. For him, the narrative tied together a parish life and a method. Attention directs energy, emotion amplifies, repetition calibrates. He called the thing he did a discipline, not a miracle. Months passed like that. Small experiments, calibrations, the stubbornness of routine. Sometimes it worked in ways that humbled him. A job that fit, a neighbor's gratitude, an unexpected reconciliation over a rusted hinge. Sometimes nothing shifted at all, and he was left with the ordinary hard work of tending to the things that required tending. People asked him for miracles. He had none to give. He told them instead what the alien had told him without insisting they accept the translator. Try practice, measure what changes, keep the generosity. There was one stubborn proof that he kept returning to, and that became a private joke he allowed himself. The number 47, once a trickle of coincidence, accrued into a patina of uncanny repetition. It showed on receipts, clocks, a child's jersey. Once, a man in the hardware store paid cash and left the exact amount that made Frank's total end in .47. Each time Frank raised the detail with neighbors, they laughed with him more than at him, because who did not like a small superstition that made days feel less random? What unsettled people more than the number was the way Frank's face softened. He had been a man who measured the world in torque and timing. Now he also measured it in small mercies. He read the scripture in his own way, sometimes aloud in the kitchen while he ate toast, sometimes muttered into the radio when a hymn rolled by. He treated what he'd learned as a complement to what he had already been taught, not as replacement. That nuance held, and it made his life complicated in the most human way. There remained a question that lay like a pebble in his shoe. Who benefits when people discover tools to shape their attention? Power, in any form, prefers consolidation. Institutions that baptize techniques into dogma risk exploitation. Frank understood that danger as cleanly as he understood oil changes. He chose transparency. He spoke plainly, he refused to set himself up as a guru, and he returned the alien gift, if gift it could be called, by using the crystals for quiet practice and not for profit. One evening, months after the ship left like a remembered dream, Frank sat at his workbench and polished the largest crystal. The light from his shop lamp caught the internal storms in the stone and threw them as small patterns onto the wall. He felt the pattern of his life bend towards steady work, small compassion, and deliberate attention. He had not been given deliverance from sorrow. His losses remained. But the knot in his chest did not pull as sharp when memory caught at it. When he told the story to me over coffee, 2 weeks shy of winter and with his hands still carrying a grease that did not wash out easily, he laughed a little at himself. "I went in to fix a machine," he said, "and came out with a way to remind myself to breathe. That is all that was promised, and it's a lot." There was no final scene in the town square with everyone converted, no dramatic exodus from churches. Instead, there was a quieter revolution, if you can call it that. People exercising the small sovereignty of deciding how to tend their attention. Some adopted the practice and found small doors opening. Some scorned it. Some were indifferent. The alien's lesson about the teacher and the translation of Jesus into a frequency lived and died in individual choices. If you are still listening, know this. The story does not end at the ship's ascent. It sets a trail. Frank's life after that day is a ledger of experiments, mismatched coincidences, and more of that same small, stubborn kindness. He still goes to church sometimes. He still argues with Pastor Williams more gently than before. He still keeps the crystals against the wood of his bench, where the light hits them and the dust makes them look like someone's forgiven memories. I tell you this because it matters how we frame our wonder. We can make idols of tools and teachers, or we can treat teaching as an invitation to disciplined practice. Frank chose the second. He did not become a prophet. He became, plainly and wonderfully, a man who cared enough to keep working on himself. There was more to tell. The tests that tightened his faith, the moments of real danger when attention alone would not be enough, the way the town finally settled into its new rumor. But that is a story for the next stretch, and it requires the time to be told without cheap collapse into spectacle. For now, hold the image of a 62-year-old mechanic standing under a cool light, 3 crystals warming in his palms, choosing to keep trying. The first real test arrived in the ordinary clothes of a winter that would not quit. Snow came early that year, a blankness that softened the town but also made things brittle. Pipes burst in the row of houses behind the feed store. A downed tree took power for 2 days. The ambulance took longer than usual because the county roads had turned to rime and ice. It was the kind of hardship that allows no metaphors, just people cold and hungry and cramped in rooms that once felt ample. It was in those hours that the difference between a useful practice and a promise of salvation became plain. One night, a neighbor, Ruth Haskins, who had been among the earliest adopters of the crystal method, pounded on Frank's shop door. Her husband was feverish and delirious. The clinic, 20 miles away, could not be reached until daylight. She had sat with him through hours, humming the thin songs she used to sing to their children, and when the fever rose, she said she did not know whether to call on what she believed or to do what she could. She wanted Frank because she trusted the steadiness in him, the way his hands moved, the fact that he'd kept his oath not to take money for lessons. He wiped his hands, took the largest crystal, and for a while they sat in the low light while he held the stone between them and breathed, with a rhythm that was not contrived but practiced. He lent her the practice he had learned, a narrow attention that refused to catastrophize, a pulse that could hold a room steady. That night, the medicine in the house was not enough to cure the disease, and the fever receded only when the clinic could finally treat it. What the practice did was small and real. It kept Ruth awake and organized. It kept her from fainting into panic. It helped her deliver water and sponge cloths with hands that were not shaking. When the doctor came the next morning, he praised the quickness of her response, not the crystalline ritual. Ruth told him both truths, that she had done what the nurse advised and that Frank's calm had kept her from forgetting to do it. The doctor listened with the mixture of skepticism and courtesy that most people afford the stories they cannot fully explain. These were the quiet tests, moments when attention smoothed a household enough for practical acts to follow. Frank learned a bitterer lesson in the weeks that followed, when a young man named Cole Murray, restless and newly surrendered to the rumor, began to treat the practice as a cure-all. Cole was slim and quick, a boy wound too tight by unemployment and a small, persistent grief. He stopped taking the medication that had kept his panic manageable because he trusted that the crystals could do what the pills had done. For a time, nothing obvious happened. Then, on a morning when the bank alarms went off 2 blocks down and the town's pulse quickened, Cole found himself undone. Attention, he learned the hard way, could steady but not replace certain scaffolds. The episode left him humiliated, and the town kinder than cruel in its response. People brought casseroles and offered rides, and some of them, more than you might expect, spoke about limits without scolding. What tightened in Frank was the humility that comes from watching clear-eyed cause and effect. He refused, more firmly than before, anyone's attempt to turn the crystals into panacea. He began saying, when asked, that the stones were not spirits nor shortcuts. They make room for practice, he told the high school teacher who wanted him to give a demonstrative talk. They are like a metronome for the mind. They do not keep roofs from leaking or make medicines work. You have to do the work. The rumor that had started as a compassionate oddity now faced its first collision with commerce. A man from the next county, slick, smelling faintly of heavy aftershave and brighter clothes than anyone in town owned, stopped in with a van that bore the medallion of a small startup. He offered to buy any crystals he could get, promising to scale the method, to bring it to online platforms, to translate frequency alignment into workshops and retreats. He used words that had no home in Frank's vocabulary: branding, monetization, viral. He offered money. He offered to set Frank up on a stage. He offered not to mention the ship if Frank would sign a modest non-disclosure. People in town listened because it was useful to listen to the possible. People in town also watched Frank because he had been plain about profit and pride. He said no. He said it simply: no to the man, no to the cash. The refusal made him unpopular with those who believed any chance at money was a blessing, and made him beloved by those who felt the same private alarm at the idea of faith turned into commodity. Pastor Williams, who had never stopped worrying that the crystals might pull parishioners away from church, softened for different reasons. He liked Frank's refusal because it brought an alliance he had not expected. The pastor and the mechanic found themselves at the same bench, trading kinds of theology, one built on sacraments and sermons, the other on breath and attention. Their arguments were long and gentle, and they ended usually with coffee and a shared recognition that neither claimed the whole truth. Danger came once more, in a form that demanded immediate bodily action. A winter fire started in the boarded mill at the edge of town, a place where old oil drums and forgotten tar drums slept like memory. Flames found tinder in the wind, and blessedly the town's volunteer firefighters arrived. Still, smoke clawed down alleys, and a single apartment building smelled of flame. In the scramble, a child's bedroom window opened, and a small boy, frightened, refused to move. His mother stood on the sidewalk, calling his name while the smoke thickened. There was no time for contemplation, for breathing practices that require quiet and will. What happened instead was a gathering of small courage, the kind that looks like muscle and rope and a neighbor climbing a ladder. Frank was there because no one divides the town's mobilization by theology. He was there because he was practical and because strong hands and calm heads are always needed. He climbed the ladder, the crystalline metronome in his pocket, doing nothing more than keeping his fingers from shaking as they tied a rope. He and another man lugged the boy down and wrapped him in a blanket. The practice he had learned did not rescue the child. The ladder and the rope and the neighbor's willingness did. But his steadiness, what had been practiced in his chest by a glow from a ship, kept the operation unpanicked. Afterward, the townsfolk spoke of heroism. Frank called it the ordinary labor of people who had been given the chance to keep each other. That balance between mystic suggestion and manual labor, between inner practice and outer responsibility, would come to define how the rumor embedded itself. For some, it became a moral discipline. The church offered classes where breath work was taught alongside scripture, and people learned to pray with both hands. For others, it remained a private device, tucked into pockets like lucky coins. The school used the practice in small ways. A history teacher who had seen what panic could do to adolescents brought a crystal into the exams room and asked for a minute of quiet. The principal accepted the minor ritual because anything that kept young people breathing less like bullets and more like birds was worth trying. Not everyone liked the new normal. There were town meetings where heated voices argued that such things could lead to superstition, to abandonments of reason. There were columns in the regional paper, some curious, some snide, about the crystal craze in Pine Hollow. There were late-night calls to Pastor Williams from out-of-state evangelists and from podcasters who wanted to make the story into a sermon or a spectacle. People in town learned the cost of curiosity. Attention draws scrutiny. But the story's true shift was not in the way the world pronounced judgment. It was in the small decisions each person made when alone. To remember breath during grief. To keep medicine while experimenting with practice. To refuse money that turned care into product. Frank's own arc narrowed to a repeated sequence of small actions: polishing the crystals, refusing offers, teaching a dozen people how to count out their inhales, getting grease under his nails. The 47 coincidences continued to wink at him: a bus that read 47 on its route, a child who handed him a note that ended with .47 cents in doodled change. He began to think of the number less as a signpost from the ship and more as a gentle absurdity that allowed him to laugh. It gave him rhythm. It gave him a way to mark time without pretending that time could be escaped. And yet, there were nights when he woke and felt the old hollow tug at him, the absence of the wife he had loved, the diminished voice of the son who lived 3 states away. In those hours, the crystals were small consolation. He learned to move between practices, to pray when the habit of the church offered shape, to breathe when panic approached, to call a friend when loneliness became a roar. The ship had taught him one tool. Life taught him the rest. The rumor settled, not into doctrine, but into a cluster of practices and friendships. Some people left town with a crystal in their pocket and never spoke of the ship again. Others kept the stones on mantelpieces, like odd paperweights. A visiting writer tried to make a tidy thesis of the whole thing and left disappointed, because you cannot sum a town's adoption the way you sum a ledger. The important shifts were not grand, but patient. Fewer fistfights outside the bar, more people willing to sit through old Aunt Edna's stories, more teenagers learning that a moment of steadiness could unglue them from urge. Through it all, Frank kept working at his bench. Grease gave way to light. Attention became a muscle that he exercised, sometimes with the crystals, sometimes without. He still argued with Pastor Williams. He still attended church on Sundays when he felt like the ritual would not hurt him. He refused to speak of prophecy in a town meeting and refused to sell rituals on a van. He kept the largest crystal polished because he liked the way the internal storms looked when the light caught them, and because, in the small hours when his hands were empty, he liked to be reminded that some things arrive without invoices and ask for nothing in return. There would come, later, an event that tested not just the limits of attention, but the ethics of secrecy. The temptation to replicate the crystal's effect by force, to manufacture calm in minds without consent. It would reveal the brittle places where kindness could be turned into control. But that was a future reckoning, one that required another sequence of choices and the sort of conversations a town only has when it has learned to speak without shouting. For now, the work remained straightforward. Keep helping your neighbor, keep refusing the quick sale, keep breathing, and keep showing up. In the winter light, under the shop lamp, with the taste of coffee still strong on his tongue, Frank hummed as he polished. The sound was small and private, and, like most small things, it carried more weight than his better instincts had expected. He had not been made whole. He had been given a habit, a way of attention that could hold a room a little straighter, while the rest of life retained its unruly business. The ship had left its shadow, the town had learned to live in it. And when the seasons turned, people would tell stories that were half laugh, half lesson, stories about rituals that worked alongside medicine and community action, about refusals that kept intimacy from becoming industry, about a man with grease under his nails who decided, again and again, to keep working on himself and on the people around him. The rumor would remain a rumor, altered by ordinary human hands. The temptation arrived like a winter sun, bright, promising, and cold. It came not as a storm, but as a polite delegation. 2 people in smart coats, a car with tinted windows, a binder of slides, and a language that sounded like aid. They called themselves a clinic at first, then a research partnership, then, when the town's appetite for labels shifted beneath them, a vendor of wellness interventions. Their leader was Marin Hale, a woman in her 30s with hair pulled back and a voice that took care to be steady. With her was Dr. Klein, a soft-eyed neurologist who spoke in curves. Risk profiles, replicable stimuli, scalable interventions. They had read the papers. They knew the writer who'd come and left with nothing. They had watched the videos other people had made on phones. They had friends in state grants. At the shop, they asked to see the crystals. Frank let them look at the largest one because resistance would have been a confrontation he did not want. He set it on the felt and turned it so light could walk through its fractures. Marin's fingers hovered, careful and fascinated. She did not ask to hold it. She did not ask to buy it. "We're not here to buy," she said. "We're here to study, to help. Imagine if what you have could help someone across the state. A veteran with nights of terror, a mother with a child who can't hold still. Imagine the number of people who might get ease if we could replicate what this thing does." Her words were sharp with generosity. Dr. Klein leaned forward and spoke of patterns, sound, heart rate entrainment, electromagnetic signatures. He drew diagrams on a pad, neat arcs that could be measured. The townspeople who had gathered, curious, protective, hopeful, listened as if to a healing sermon. Then he said, casually, "We can't promise miracles. We can promise reduced symptoms. We can promise reproducible effects." A few hands rose. A man from the diner, Joe, asked about cost. Aunt Edna's nephew asked if it could be used on his sister, who hadn't left the house in months. Pastor Williams kept his expression small. Pastor Williams had always loved remedies that came with restraint. Frank felt the old hollow tug at him then, the shape of his grief under new light, and the tug was not simply personal. He had watched how attention spread, how habits became beds people could sleep on. He had seen kindness turn to product once before, in small ways. The paid prayer nights, the miracle cures sold as tinctures that tasted like myth. He thought, too, of consent. The crystals had entered lives because people chose them, sometimes because they were curious, sometimes because they were desperate. They had not been forced. "How do you mean replicate?" he asked. Dr. Klein smiled with a curiosity that felt clinical rather than warm. He spoke of recordings, of sensors that could map the small fluctuations in the room when someone sat with a stone and breathed. He proposed building devices that emit similar pulses, that could be installed in clinics, that could be used in group sessions. "We could offer sliding scale fees," he said. "We could partner with insurers." Marin added, "We can anonymize data, we can publish, we can bring funds." There was a rumor in the room then, thin and electric. This might mean real money for a town that had been learning to scrape together. It might mean jobs. It might mean attention for people who had no other door open. It might also mean that what had been intimate became an industry. What followed was not abrupt. It was a soft erosion. First came the proposals. The clinic wanted permission to take a few samples of the stone's environment. No stones would leave town, they promised. They only wanted to study. Then a grant came into being, applied for by an outside university with a partner that had made calm music apps. Then a local council meeting was scheduled, a public forum advertised on flyers and on a single, carefully liked post. The meetings were long. People spoke in different languages of need. A teacher described students who could not settle their hands. A veteran, who had never talked about the war, wept and described nights with lamps bright on the floor. A pharmacist worried about side effects and offered, with a practical face, to be on call if anything went wrong. A young woman, Lydia, whose brother had pulled away after the ship passed overhead, spoke for many when she said, "If there is something that gives him a minute that isn't a pill, I want to know." Frank listened. He tried to keep his voice to small, necessary truths. "These stones are not instruments stationed behind a glass," he said. "They're people noticing something in themselves and agreeing to hold it. That's different from turning the process into a machine." The first demonstration happened at the high school auditorium in March, when the snow had begun to melt and the town needed a story to lift it. Dr. Klein set up equipment that hummed and showed graphs on a screen. He asked for volunteers. 3 people came forward. One of them, Lydia's brother, who moved like someone close to saying yes to any help he could get. The doctor explained consent forms. He explained potential outcomes. He explained he couldn't promise anything. Everyone signed. He did not take a crystal from a hand. He mapped breaths, tones, the way people's shoulders softened when someone spoke steady syllables. He played a recording back of a session in which a small stone had been present and then turned a dial. For a minute, the lights of the auditorium seemed to breathe along with the sound. The volunteers laughed softly, then grew still. Cameras made of phone glass recorded the stillness, and the audience inhaled with it. Then Dr. Klein did something he had said might be possible. He amplified the signal. He wanted to show replicability. He wanted to show that measurable change could be scaled. For the first 30 seconds, there was nothing but the hum of a machine and the sound of people breathing in a room built for listening. Some in the audience nodded, moved by relief. Lydia's brother had his face softened. Joe from the diner rubbed his eyes as if he'd woken. Then, slowly, Lydia's brother's smile thinned and his hand clenched under his jacket. He tried to speak and couldn't find his voice. A murmuring rose through the auditorium like birds startled. It was not dramatic. Nothing exploded. It was a retraction, a small, frightening flattening. Lydia's brother sat as if somebody had drawn a curtain over part of him. His speech, already sparse, took on those particular pauses of someone who could not access a word. He did not shake. He did not cry. He simply did not respond when his name was called. Someone in the front row, an old woman who had come for the demonstration because she read about calm sessions in a newsletter, stood and shouted, "Stop!" The sound ricocheted. Dr. Klein hit the off switch as if he had been waiting for permission to be frightened. "What did you do?" Pastor Williams demanded, his voice thicker than usual. Dr. Klein looked as if he had been reprimanded by a child instead of being watched by a room of neighbors who knew one another's histories. "We amplified a pattern," he said. "We overshot. We must." "But you didn't get consent for being made less," said Mr. Alvarez from the hardware store. "You didn't ask to flatten his voice. You promised no harm." The technical language fell off like shedding leaves. People began to say what they had been thinking all along, but louder, that the difference between presence and production is consent. But kindness sold as intervention is often kindness with strings. That an ease without the right to refuse is a quiet sort of theft. The town's small, patient ethics, its culture of asking, of passing a cup and waiting, felt exposed. For years they had taken odd things into their circle, and then, as a group, taught each other boundaries. Now someone had walked into the circle with instruments and spreadsheets. In the week that followed, fractures grew visible. The clinic put out a statement expressing regret and promising a review. Dr. Klein called it an experimental anomaly, something to be learned from. Marin offered to fund counseling and expressed sorrow. Some in town accepted the gestures as appropriate. Others wanted more, an apology with teeth, a promise not to pursue commercialization, a formal covenant. A smaller group wanted to proceed. They argued that if care could be scaled, people shouldn't be denied it because others feared the moral consequences. They spoke of desperate households, of mothers alone at night, of the scale of suffering that could make petrochemical comforts pale. They asked for pilot programs, for oversight. Frank found himself in the middle of those tides, as if he were a rock by a river. He could see the arguments on both banks. He remembered evenings polishing, the way light turned storm to calm inside a stone. He remembered a child's hand offering him 0.47 cents, the bus that wore the number like a grin. He remembered the banalness of good habits, breath, coffee, conversation, and he remembered the way the town had become itself, not by machines, but by repeated attention. He convened conversations in the shop. People came not in formal robes, but with casseroles, with worried notes, with children dropping their scooters underfoot. He refused, politely and then with more force, to be the town's only arbiter. He did not want to sign orders he could not enforce. But he offered a practice. Anyone who would speak about using crystals or patterns in public would have to come to a meeting where the first question asked would always be, "Who says yes?" They called those gatherings the evenings, though they did not meet only at night. The evenings were slow and stubborn. People practiced saying hard things kindly. They put boundaries on their language: consent, informed, voluntary, no sale. They wrote these words on butcher paper and pinned them around the room so the terms would not be lost in the heat of the moment. Marin attended 2 of the evenings. She listened. At first, she came with a notebook and a career's habit of collecting quotes that might later be shaped into policy. Then she came with a coffee and a burr of tiredness in her speech that revealed a woman who had been convinced by grant committees that her work would save lives, and then unmoored by a demonstration gone wrong. Frank did not know what he'd hoped for from her, an epiphany perhaps, or a show of contrition. What he received was quieter, a woman who said simply, "I didn't think about this the way you did. I thought of problems and solutions. I didn't look enough at people." Words like that mattered because they were small admissions and because they were paired with action. Marin began to offer, not funds for clinics, but support for the town's own programs. Funds for community-led groups, resources for training in consent practices, grants for the local school to hire a counselor who would not use any device built to replicate a crystal's effect. Dr. Klein, for his part, submitted a report that recommended pausing replication research and suggested an ethics board that would include townspeople. Not everyone was satisfied. Some wanted bans. Some wanted prosecution for the auditorium demonstration. Others wanted to open a clinic the next week. A few fell into old grudges and made the conversation personal. But the evenings kept returning. People brought soup and patience. They learned slowly how to say no without burning a bridge. Then, one night, when Frank was finishing up and the lamp had put a slow halo across the bench, he felt the shop's bell cut a clean sound. Someone had come to the door late. He set down his cloth and found Lydia standing there, her hair damp from melting snow, a grocery bag in one hand and a small wrapped object in the other. It was a crystal, smaller than his largest, wrapped in paper. "I can't afford much," she said. Her voice had the weather of someone who had ridden a long road to come home. "My brother asked me to bring it back. He says someone from the clinic offered him a session. He wanted to try it. He said he wanted to feel right." Frank looked at the stone in her hands and then at Lydia's face. She was not asking a policy question. She was asking for guidance with a thing she had already given away. "Did he consent?" Frank asked. Lydia's eyes filled with the kind of honesty that is too young to be strategic. "He said yes. He said yes because I asked him to. He thought seeing a doctor in a suit meant some kind of order. He thought if the town said yes, it would be okay. He didn't know the difference." Frank wrapped the crystal gently. He felt the weight of it like a small secret. Outside, traffic sighed like a slow river. The evenings had not ended the tension. They had given it language and a slower tempo. But there remained the simple human fact that things people loved could be given away in hunger or in hope. "Bring him by," Frank said. "Tomorrow. We'll sit. We'll breathe. We'll not make promises. We'll ask him what he wants. We'll teach him to say no. We'll teach him to come back if something feels wrong." Lydia nodded and left. Frank sat by the lamp and hummed. Grease had not lifted from his nails. It was a map of the work. He considered the week ahead. A council vote loomed. The town would decide whether to allow outside trials, to create a covenant around consent, to install oversight, to permit the replication of the thing that had slipped awake in their streets. The vote would not be a clean answer. It would be a negotiation of hopes, to relieve suffering without erasing the person who suffered. Outside, a bus rolled by with the number 47 blinking under its windshield like a small wink. Frank polished the crystal nearest his bench until the fractures inside looked like distant, patient weather. The lamp made the lines of the stone glow. He thought of the ship's shadow and of the way the town kept answering it, with habit and with conversation, with the careful refusal of easy sail. The temptation to invent serenity for a price would not evaporate with policy or with the evenings. It would return in other proposals, in other faces at other kitchen tables. But for now there were choices to make that belonged to the town. Whether to codify the practice of asking, whether to accept resources that arrived with conditions, whether to make law out of neighborliness. He set the stone down and went to the door. The night was clear. Someone had left a paper cup on the step, half full of coffee. He took it into the shop and sat with the amber warmth. In the corner, the largest crystal caught the light and held it, not demanding anything in return. Tomorrow, the town would gather. People would speak. People would bear the discomfort of being asked to think not only of ease but of agency. Frank folded his hands as he had learned to do in the small places where decision felt holy. He breathed in and out. The sound was not a miracle. It was, as it had always been, a choice to continue. At dawn, the next day, the meeting would begin. The town would not know yet how it would vote. They had not reached the future reckoning. But they would try, together, to find the language that kept intimacy from becoming industry, and to understand what it meant to protect both hope and the right to refuse. The lamp blinked once more as Frank rose and went to fetch the morning's coffee. The bench waited, patient as a promise.